Okay, so you already know me. I'm Adriana Cochat, and I'm a monitor in this edition of AstroCamp. I was a student in the same edition as Guillermo, and I'm currently studying biotechnology and pharmacy in Universidad de Salamanca. And well, let's start with the science behind the myth, vampires, zombies, and more. So this will be the topics covered in the presentation. And basically, I don't think these guys need an introduction, but the vampires are reanimated corpses that rise from the dead and are believed to suck the life force out of its victims. In our case, in our cultures, it's the blood due to its relevance, but not in all cultures it's blood. For example, the Eskimos have a vampire that sucks on body temperature. The zombies are reanimated corpses, mindless, with no self-conscience or willpower. So basically uni students during finals week. They're sometimes considered more of a philosophical questions about separation of the soul and body, but I won't be covering that. I'll be covering the physics? No, the biology of it. And then there's Frankenstein's monster, which in the novel, it remains unnamed, so please don't call it Frankenstein, which consists of sewed-up body parts, big ones at that, because they're easier to join and they led to smaller error, according to the scientist himself, brought to life using electricity. If you read the novel, you know he's a sensible, rational, and purely lonely creature, so feel sorry for him. This is mainly the abstract of this presentation, which I'll summarize by saying that I believe that these myths usually are like scary stories we tell people for them to obey, fear something, or belong to a community. And that these monsters are in reality sufferers of disease, or maybe people who were decomposing and we didn't understand what was happening. The aims and objectives of this presentation are these: to reason the origin of the myth of these monsters and to show you how to structure a scientific paper. This was a bibliographic research. I used these sources mainly on the internet, but I also used a book, which is De la Sangre. It's in Spanish, and it's what I used for the vampire part mainly. So, we'll start by discussing the vampires, which may make us look at blood consumption in another light. Some of the evidence of the importance of blood in our culture is the fact that it's present in our gastronomy. We eat that. That's morcilla, the Spanish one will know. And there's also like blood pudding. And during the, we eat blood. Not as long ago, there were people herding the slaughterhouses, ready to drink the blood directly from the animals. I'm sorry for the vegan, yeah. But we also study blood-consuming animals, like the vampire bats from the family Desmodontinae, whose saliva have components which could be applied in medicine as anticoagulants or vasodilators, such as one protein called draculin. I'll let you guess where that comes from. As well as for their ability to process the blood they ingest by having a different digestive system from ours. So that would help us understand how ours work. So vampires are defined as reanimated corpses. So people would just pry open recently deceased people's coffins and find plump and reddish bodies. They thought, oh my goodness, they just woke up, they're alive. They've got longer hair, longer nails. They just woke up and feasted on somebody's blood. Let's kill them. Well, the thing is that the plump body is just bloating from the putrefaction of its guts. So we've got bacteria in our guts, and when they eat us, they liberate some gases, and that makes us bloated. The reddish spots were liver mortis, which is due to the accumulation of blood once the heart stops beating and bringing it back. And the hair and nail growth is actually just an illusion. Our hair and nails don't grow. It's just our skin retracting because we lose water and we dehydrate. So I don't think this is an explanation for the origin, but an explanation of the propagation of these hysteria waves. especially during the Middle Ages. And then we've got mental illness, in which the patient behaves the way that vampires we know do. Van der Weg, a psychiatrist, says that the bloodthirst and affinity for dark spaces, basically behaving like a vampire, is due to an abnormal and disturbed childhood. I mean, it makes sense. But we also have people nowadays that believe to be themselves vampires. There are vampires among us. And people like Stephen Kaplan, self-proclaimed vampirologist and paranormal investigator, study their habits in the Vampire Research Center and Parapsychology Institute of America, which basically studies that these people drug each other. So they're unconscious in the moment of sucking the blood out of each other, which could lead to potential psychological distress and the transmission of diseases. But there's people for everything. There's people who eat live animals or drink blood thinking they will give them more power. And it's an eating disorder described by the Renfield syndrome, given the name, as I discussed earlier in dinner one day. Sorry for bringing these topics up in dinner time. Came from the character in the Dracula novel. And then there's paraphilia, in which it has more erotic connotations, which I won't be discussing. And then there's diseases, which I personally think it's the best explanation for the origin, since mental illness is a behavior of the vampire, and it almost has a circular definition. We wouldn't have the behavior vampire-like if we didn't have a vampire to begin with. So then there's the diseases, which will be discussed in the following slides. These are the diseases I considered associated with vampirism, according to various papers I read, and also my own basic research on them. So the main criteria I focused on was contagion, because according to the myth of the vampire, they could just transform others into vampires through bites, which is basically an exchange of bodily fluids, that saliva and blood, and zoonosis, which means it can be transmitted between people and animals, which is also important due to the myth of the vampire relying on the vampire being able to transform itself into animals such as wolves, bats, rabid dogs, which are usually linked to diseases or the transmission of rabies, Black Death, tuberculosis, malaria, sleep sickness, all of that. And they aid to the contagion of the supposed vampirism. Then there's its frequency. So it wouldn't make sense for many waves of vampire craze and hysteria to start up in all over the world if it was a rare disease and only 5 cases of it were documented through history, wouldn't it? So taking those into account, I'll explain the following. Tuberculosis is the manifestations that arise from the infection of this cool bacteria, which is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's a zoonotic disease, which means that animals could get it and we could get it from them. And basically it affects the lungs and prompts our immune system to overreact on it, being that our own immune system causes the damage to our tissues. So we have a bacteria and it decides the lung is the ideal place to live in. So it goes to the lung and then our immune system says, well, you know what? We're going to bunch up a number of cells around it. Those cells are going to die. And so necrosis ensues. We have a destruction of tissues in the lung. We have difficulty breathing. We spit blood, which could make a similarity to a bloody mouth after having feasted on blood. And there's anemia, which causes pallor and fatigue, which are symptoms that are associated with bite victims. And then as this type of anemia, it's caused because you're losing blood. It's treated with upping the levels of iron, which could make them crave blood, which explained the relatively common sight in women in Madrid some decades ago, who made the news when swarming around the slaughterhouses with glass and jugs and they wanted to take the blood from the slaughterhouse. Then there's porphyria, which I'm sorry for the pictures, they're a bit nasty. I choose the least nasty out of them. So the porphyria is a group of disorders characterized by a defect in one of the enzymes in the synthesis of the heme group, which is the one in here. Okay, this is the group that's responsible for taking the oxygen from the air and giving it to the red blood cells. The oxygen binds to the iron atom with a valence of 2. And if we don't have that group, we won't be able to have a functional red blood cell, and that red blood cell just dies off. If we don't have a heme group, we have the precursors of the heme group, which are the porphyrins, which are toxic and tend to react to sunlight because of its chemical structure, which gives skin damage when it's accumulated in the skin, related to the sunlight, which is photosensitivity. It could also cause hypertrichosis, which means excessive growth of hair in one area, which could also be related to the werewolf myth. And then erythromelalgia, which basically is translated as red teeth, which is due to the buildup of the porphyrins in the bones or the teeth. And a quirk, a funny story, an aversion to garlic in porphyria patients due to the presence of an enzyme that destroys the blood cells, which worsens the symptoms. So what happens if they drink blood? Well, if they drink blood, they up their iron levels. If they up their iron levels, the synthesis of the heme group is encouraged. But if it's incomplete, then you've got more porphyrins, so the disease worsens. So that doesn't make much sense. But you could think, well, what if there is a substance in the blood that could inhibit the synthesis of the heme group? And there is. It's a substance called hematin, which is like a twin sister of the heme group, but instead of an iron with a valence 2, it has an iron with a valence 3, and that could help. The bad thing is that it only reaches the body through blood transfusions or medulla transplants, but you can't drink blood and absorb the hematin, so these patients do not crave blood. And so even though this was the first disease to be linked with vampirism through an article in the New York Times in 1985, it doesn't make much sense if we see it this way. Then there's rabies. Rabies is the disease caused by the rhabdovirus, which is this cute virus here, which has a bullet shape, and it infects its host through the saliva in the bite from a previously infected animal, given it's a zoonosis, and it's contagious. Any mammal can be a host for the virus, including bats, rodents, dogs, wolves, which are the animals more frequently associated to vampires. It replicates in the muscle, and then from there, it goes to the nerves and causes wreck. It causes a wreck in the nervous system. First, through the peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves, it causes muscle spasms, and then it goes to the central nervous system, and it leads to death. It causes aggressive behavior because it affects the brain, biting, muscle spasms, which, if in the throat, they can be extremely painful and could explain the hydrophobia, which is the aversion to water, or even mirrors, because they see the reflection and they think it's water. When the rabies patient sees water, it triggers these swallowing throat spasms, which are extremely painful and cause this aversion to water. So the vampire fears the holy water or just water? No. It was a common disease back then. I mean, there are still cases of rabies, so we could take that into account. Then there's pellagra. Pellagra is a name given to the niacin vitamin deficiency, so vitamin B3 deficiency, which is not contagious, not a zoonosis, but it was fairly common during the Middle Ages, especially after discovering corn. They fell in love with corn. What happens is corn does not have vitamin B3, nor it has the amino acid tryptophan, which is the precursor in our body for this vitamin. That led to cells dying off because they needed this B3. and that caused lesions in the skin in the shape of these scarring and edema, which is the accumulation of liquid, and around the neck, and what's called the Casals necklace. Also glossitis, which is the inflammation of the tongue, which gave the appearance of a bloody mouth, i.e. sucking blood. And then it could also affect the central nervous system, leading to dementia, insomnia, and aggressive behavior. Then there's some diseases I wanted to add, because both illnesses are caused by parasitic protozoans, and it's because of the diversity in the vampire myths. I was going down a rabbit hole and I found a vampire encyclopedia, and well, I read the A section, like whole A section, and I found the Adze from Africa, concretely from Ghana, which is a vampire that could transform themselves into insects, such as flies or mosquitoes, which are the vectors of these diseases that are either endemic for Africa in the case of the sleep sickness, or widely spread across humid and warm climates like malaria. And malaria was only eradicated from Spain after 1964. So bear that in mind, it's fairly common. Sleep sickness is caused by this parasite called Trypanosomia brucei, which is that one. And it affects the central nervous system, causing dementia, an inversion of the sleep-wake cycle, which means insomnia at night and drowsiness during the day. And then it leads to coma and ultimate death. And malaria is caused by protozoans from the Plasmodium genus and affects the red blood cells, leading to anemia. It also affects the liver, depending on the concrete species of the protozoan, but it leads to anemia, and that is one of the symptoms we discussed could be related to the myth of the vampire. But enough about vampires, let's go zombies. So in IT, which is where the myth originated, they were studying the origin of the myth and came to two hypotheses, which is the social one, which related the myth of the zombie to the custom of uniting the schizophrenic patients with grieving families, which would accept them as their returned loved ones. So they came back from the dead and manifested themselves as schizophrenic patients. Or the chemical hypothesis, which related the similarity in behavior to the zombies and people who are suffering from poisoning from TTX or curare and the effects of other drugs such as scopolamine. These drugs are similar in the effects they cause, however, different in the mechanism by which they cause them. TTX has a charge and blocks ions from entering the cell, so neurons are unable to share the signals. So neurons can send signals to the muscle, and the muscle doesn't move, and so you can't breathe, because breathing involves your muscles. You can choke from this TTX poisoning. Curare is also a muscle paralysis agent, but because it blocks the acetylcholine neurotransmitter in the level of the union between the muscle and the nerve. And scopolamine affects mainly the brain and as well as the smooth muscle, and also impedes the union of this neurotransmitter. It all leads to lethargy, amnesia, hypnosis, and poor coordination. If it is dosed wrong, it could cause shortness of breath or ultimately death from respiratory failure. But there were still people trying to poison each other to make them believe they were zombies, to take advantage of each other. But nowadays, we don't go all about dragging each other. Well, curious fact, scopolamine is used as a date rape drug. It's known in Spanish as burundanga. So be careful. In the streets, we know loads of drugs as zombie drugs. And these are three of them. The dysomorphine, also known as crocodile for the Russian word for crocodile, due to skin necrosis and scaly sores it causes around the site of injection. It's an opioid drug. which is addictive, really addictive. And it's 10 times more potent than morphine. It's sedative, and so it feels good, but you crave it, and it leads to aggressive behavior. When homemade, its purification process is neglected, and that's what causes the necrosis around the injection sites. And then there's alpha-paralidinopenthiophenone, also known as FLACA, which is really easier to pronounce. It's a psychostimulant. It works by upping the levels of excitatory neurotransmitters. So noradrenaline and dopamine, which make our brains work faster, and maybe our hearts pump faster. They make us have an agitated delirium or could lead to paranoid psychosis, but they're also, curiously, the same drugs, the same mechanism of action in antidepressants, treatment for ADHD, or treatment for Parkinson's. And then there's xylazine, which is used as a cutting agent for fentanyl, which is another opioid drug. I already discussed opioids. And it's a veterinarian sedative. It ups the levels of adrenaline in our brain, but it does so in a receptor which, by negative feedback, lowers the levels of these neurotransmitters and relaxes us, leading to anesthesia, analgesia, and lethargy, but also to vasoconstriction, which could lead to the necrosis associated with the rotting tissue, with zombies, basically. But one may look also for the origin of the myth in other hypotheses, such as in video games or in The Last of Us, where the outbreak is due to the infection of a cordyceps fungus. Well, the cordyceps fungus exists, and they have been used in Chinese medicine for ages. The thing is, it doesn't affect humans yet. It's a parasitic fungus that affects ants, or, well, arthropods in general, insects. And it goes through its external exoskeleton, and then it gets to the nervous system. And through gene regulation, it controls its mind, changes its behavior to go find the adequate climate for the fungus to develop, bite down on a branch, and be unable to get out of that state and die off. So the fungus can now eat the ant's tissue and lead to a fructiferous body, which could spread more spores. So neat, evolution did that, but it doesn't affect humans. Don't worry. And then there's the last monster I wanted to discuss, which is Frankenstein's monster. The novel was written in 1818, but the context in which this publication was, in which this novel was written, was a publication in 1791, De Viribus Electricitatis in Motu Musculari Commentarius, by Luigi Galvani, in which he states that the animal brain produces electricity through a chemical reaction that is transmitted to the muscular tissue. Years later, they would discover it's because of the differentiation potential. And then it causes muscle construction. It was initially tested on frogs and using atmospheric electricity, lightning, and then on corpses. And it was studied whether a corpse could be brought back to life using electricity. That's why the monster came by, and this amazing novel was published. Then there's my conclusion, which is the words from Hippocrates, or I think they're the words from Hippocrates, which is the supposedly godsend nature of some illnesses is nothing but man's lack of knowledge about them. So I don't believe these monsters were sinners punished by God, but misunderstood patients. And the development of science could help us erase some of the stigma and myths around those diseases. This is my bibliography, and thank you for your attention.